The night was magical. The city lights glowed softly, and the air carried the excitement of something special about to happen. People from all walks of life were gathering at the Grand Concert Hall, one of the most beautiful places in the city. Its golden lights, tall pillars, and sparkling chandeliers made it look like a palace of dreams. Inside, hundreds of people filled the seats, whispering, smiling, and waiting eagerly. Everyone had come to see one man, a world-famous pianist, who was known for his incredible melodie, who was known for his incredible talent and charming personality. He had performed in the greatest cities of the world, Paris, London, New York, and tonight, he was performing in front of his home crowd again. His name was known everywhere. People admired him not only for his music, but also for his confidence, his elegance, and the way he made every concert feel alive. Every time he touched the piano, it seemed like magic was born from his fingertips. The audience waited as the lights dimmed slowly. The murmur of voices faded into silence. Then the spotlight shone on the stage, where a single grand piano stood, shining black, elegant, and perfect. The pianist appeared from behind the curtain, dressed in a black suit, smiling proudly as the audience erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. People cheered. He bowed slightly, soaking in the admiration, as if it was the music itself. He sat down gracefully at the piano bench, adjusted his jacket, and placed his hands on the keys. For a brief moment, there was complete silence, the kind of silence that makes your heart beat faster. Then, he began to play. The first notes filled the hall like waves of soft wind. The melody was gentle, yet powerful. Each note flowed into the next with precision and beauty. The crowd was mesmerized. Some closed their eyes, some held their breath, and others simply smiled, unable to believe they were witnessing such perfection. His fingers moved so fast and yet so gracefully, like they had a life of their own. The music seemed to tell a story, one that touched every heart in the room as the performance went on. The pianist's confidence grew. He loved the attention, the respect, the admiration. Every cheer from the audience made him play with more pride. Deep down, he believed that no one could match his talent. He was the best, and he knew it. His ego, though hidden behind a charming smile, was large and unshakable. He enjoyed not just the music, but the power it gave him over people's emotions. After a long and powerful piece, the crowd clapped loudly, shouting his name. He stood up, bowed again, and flashed a confident grin. "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen," he said with a voice full of pride. "You've been a wonderful audience." The applause slowly faded as he took a sip of water and smiled again. He decided to take a short break before the next part of his concert. As he looked around the hall, his eyes caught something, or rather, someone that caught his attention. In the front row sat a simple woman, maybe in her late 40s. Wearing a plain dress and holding a small handbag in her lap, she looked calm and humble, not dressed like the others who wore fancy clothes and jewelry. Her eyes were kind, and she smiled politely when he glanced her way. Something about her made him curious. She didn't look like the type who usually attended grand concerts. Maybe she came with a friend or got a free ticket. He smirked slightly, his mischievous side waking up. He whispered to himself, "Let's make this evening a little more fun." The idea formed quickly in his mind. A small prank, nothing serious. He thought it would be entertaining to invite her on stage and ask her to play the piano in front of everyone. He imagined the crowd laughing, the woman getting shy, and him turning it into a playful moment. After all, who would expect a simple woman to actually know how to play? It would make the night more interesting, at least for him. He smiled as he stood up once again, ready to speak to the audience before continuing his next piece. The crowd waited, expecting another masterpiece. The pianist, still full of pride and confidence, had no idea that his harmless little prank would soon become the most unforgettable moment of his life, a moment that would humble him. move him, and change the way he saw music forever. The lights above him sparkled. The piano gleamed, and the audience waited in eager silence. The famous pianist took the microphone in his hand and looked at the crowd with a playful smile. The air was full of energy, but no one knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would turn a simple concert into a story the world would talk about for years to come. At that moment, the night was still young. The audience was full of excitement. And the pianist was unaware that his next words would set off a chain of events that would touch millions of hearts around the world. Asterisk. The pianist had just finished his breathtaking performance. The audience clapped so loudly that it felt like thunder rolling through the hall. People stood up, cheering, calling his name. He smiled proudly, soaking in the praise. For him, this was more than just music. Was a show of power, talent, and admiration. He felt untouchable. As the crowd settled, he decided to take a short break before his next piece. He sipped a bit of water and looked around, his eyes wandering across the rows of glowing faces. That's when he noticed her in the front row. Sitting quietly among the well-dressed guests was a woman who looked completely different from the rest. She was wearing a simple blue dress, plain but neat. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her hands rested calmly on her lap. She wasn't clapping loudly or cheering. She simply smiled softly, as if she was there just to enjoy the music, not the show. The pianist tilted his head slightly. Something about her presence caught his attention. Maybe it was the calmness in her eyes, or the fact that she didn't look like someone who belonged to this glamorous world of fame and luxury. For a moment, he wondered why she was even there. He leaned back slightly and smirked to himself. Maybe she's someone's guest, he thought. Or maybe she's just a random music lover who got lucky with a ticket. A mischievous idea crossed his mind. He was famous not only for his talent, but also for his playful, sometimes arrogant humor. The audience loved his charm, his jokes, his spontaneous interactions. So he thought, why not have a little fun? He stood up and walked toward the microphone. The lights followed him. The audience grew silent, expecting him to announce his next song. Instead, he smiled and said, "You know, ladies and gentlemen, music is not just for professionals like MI, something everyone can enjoy." People laughed softly, agreeing. Then he turned toward the simple woman in the front row and pointed gently in her direction. "Madam," he said kindly, "would you like to come up here and play something for us?" The crowd chuckled. A few people looked at each other, whispering. It was clear they thought he was joking. The woman looked surprised, her eyes widening. She pointed to herself, unsure if he really meant her. "Yes, you," the pianist said with a friendly smile that hid his amusement. "Come on, don't be shy. Just a few notes. We'd all love to hear you play." The hall filled with laughter and applause, encouraging her to go. The woman hesitated. She wasn't expecting to be called out like that, especially not in front of hundreds of people. For a few seconds, she looked uncomfortable. But something inside her, maybe courage, maybe curiosity, made her stand up. She smiled politely and nodded. Slowly, she began walking toward the stage. Her steps were quiet but steady. The pianist gestured for her to come closer as the spotlight followed her across the hall. The audience watched with growing curiosity. When she reached the stage, the pianist greeted her with a small bow. "Welcome," he said charmingly. "What's your name?" "My name is Clara," she said softly. "Clara," he repeated with a smile. "Beautiful name. So, Clara, do you play piano?" She hesitated for a moment, then replied. A little. The audience laughed again, thinking she was being humble. The pianist grinned. "Well then, let's see what a little sounds like." He gestured toward the grand piano and stepped aside, giving her the stage. The woman looked at the piano for a few seconds. It was a magnificent instrument, polished and shining under the lights. She took a deep breath and sat down slowly on the bench. Her hands hovered over the keys but didn't touch them yet. The hall fell completely silent. Everyone watched closely, waiting for what they thought would be a funny, awkward moment. The pianist crossed his arms, half smiling, confident that this little joke would make the crowd laugh and lighten the mood before his next performance. But as the seconds passed, something changed. The woman's expression softened. Her fingers began to move, gently at first, pressing the keys as if she were touching something sacred. The first notes that came out were soft, almost like whispers. But then they grew stronger, clearer, and more beautiful. The melody filled the entire hall with warmth and emotion. Every note seemed to tell a story of love, loss, and dreams long forgotten. The pianist's smile slowly faded. His eyes widened in disbelief. The audience, who had expected to laugh, sat frozen. The simple woman who looked so ordinary just moments ago was playing like a true master. The sound of the piano was not just music. It was pure emotion flowing through her fingertips. Each chord struck something deep inside the hearts of everyone listening. The pianist stood still, unable to move. His heart began to pound, not from pride this time, but from awe. The woman he had chosen for a prank had just turned his entire concert into something divine. And as the final note echoed through the hall, fading into silence, the audience realized they had just witnessed something truly extraordinary. Asterisk. The last note from Clara's fingers lingered in the air like a soft whisper that refused to fade. The sound was so beautiful, so unexpected, that no one moved. The audience, who had moments ago been ready to laugh, now sat frozen in stunned silence. It was as if time had stopped. You could almost hear the sound of hearts beating in the stillness. Clara slowly lifted her hands off the piano keys. Her eyes still closed for a brief second, lost in the world her music had created. When she finally opened them, she looked around shyly, unsure of what kind of reaction to expect. Her heart was pounding, not because she was scared, but because she had let out something deeply personal. Music wasn't just notes to her. It was a memory, a feeling, a piece of her soul. The famous pianist, who had once stood proudly beside her, was now completely still. The confident grin that had once curved on his lips was gone. In its place was an expression of pure disbelief. His eyes followed her every move, as though he couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. For a long, breathless moment, the entire concert hall was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, filled with emotion that words cannot express. The audience didn't clap yet. They didn't cheer. They simply sat there, trying to process what they had just heard. And then, someone in the back stood up and began clapping slowly, respectfully. Another person joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the hall erupted into thunderous applause, cheers, and even tears. People stood to their feet, giving Clara the standing ovation she had never imagined in her life. But for Clara, that moment felt unreal. She had come to the concert to enjoy the music, not to become part of it. She didn't expect to touch so many hearts. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood up and turned toward the audience, her face glowing with a soft mix of surprise and humility. The pianist, still standing nearby, blinked rapidly as if waking from a dream. He tried to smile, but his lips quivered. This was the same man who had once performed in front of kings and queens, who believed he had reached the highest level of mastery. Yet here he was silenced by a woman he had invited as a joke. He slowly walked toward her. The audience went quiet again, curious to see what he would do. Would he be angry? Embarrassed? Would he admit what had just happened? The spotlight followed him as he approached the simple woman who had just outshone him without even trying. He stopped beside her, looked at the grand piano, then at her hands. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, softly, he said, "That was incredible. Clara looked at him with kind eyes. "Thank you," she replied gently. "It's been a long time since I played." Her words were simple, but they hit him harder than he expected. A long time since I played. How could someone who hadn't touched a piano in years play like that? How could such emotion, precision, and beauty come from someone so humble and unassuming? The pianist turned back toward the audience, raising his hand as if to say something. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I thought I was inviting someone for fun. But it seems tonight I've been taught a lesson instead." The crowd cheered louder, understanding the honesty in his voice. Clara smiled shyly, lowering her gaze as tears filled her eyes. She wasn't looking for attention or fame. All she wanted was to share something beautiful. The pianist motioned for her to take another bow. And together, they stood side by side as the audience clapped endlessly. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment that would later spread across the world. But inside, the pianist felt something shift. It wasn't humiliation, it was humility. For the first time in a long time, he felt small in the best way possible. When the applause finally began to fade, Clara stepped down from the stage. The pianist watched her go, still processing everything. He sat back at the piano, placed his fingers on the keys, and tried to play again, but something felt different. The same notes he had played for years now sounded empty. Her music had opened something in him, a truth he had forgotten. That music isn't about perfection, it's about heart. As she disappeared into the crowd, a part of him wished he could talk to her more. He wanted to know who she was, what her story was, and how she had learned to play like that. But deep down, he knew that maybe it was better this way. Sometimes, the most beautiful things in life happen once and leave a mark that never fades. The concert continued that night, but something had changed. The audience listened differently. The pianist played differently. The air itself seemed filled with new meaning. And in the quiet corner of the hall, a simple woman sat again in her seat, hands clasped. A gentle smile on her face, knowing she had shared a piece of her soul with the world. And perhaps reminded, one proud musician, what true art really means. The crowd would remember that night, not for the pianist's fame, but for the moment when humility met genius and created something truly unforgettable. The applause had finally faded, but the sound of Clara's music still echoed in everyone's hearts. The pianist sat quietly on his bench, his hands resting on the piano keys, though he didn't play another note. He just stared at them, those same keys he had mastered all his life, and for the first time, he felt small before them. The audience was still whispering. They couldn't stop talking about what had just happened. Who was she? Did you see her play? That was unbelievable. People looked around as if searching for answers, their faces full of wonder. The woman who had been invited as a joke had now become the star of the night. Clara, meanwhile, had returned to her seat. Her heart was still racing, but not because of fear. It was joy. The kind that comes from doing something that truly belongs to your soul. She didn't care about the attention. She didn't even look around to see who was staring. For her, it wasn't about being seen, it was about being heard. Back on stage, the pianist cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice slightly shaky, "I think we've all witnessed something extraordinary tonight. Music has a way of finding its way to the right hearts. And tonight, it found its way through hers." The audience clapped again, this time not for him, but for the woman sitting quietly in the crowd. Clara smiled politely and nodded her head, but her eyes were soft, almost sad. As if the music had reopened a part of her past she had long buried. After the concert, as the lights came back on and people began to leave, the pianist stepped off the stage. He didn't go backstage or to the green room like he usually did. Instead, he walked straight toward the audience. He wanted to find her. He needed to understand who she was, the woman who had, in just a few minutes, changed the way he saw his own art. He spotted her near the exit, getting ready to leave quietly, her coat folded neatly over her arm. "Excuse me," he called softly. She turned around, surprised to see him there. "Oh, Mr. Laurent," she said, dressing him by name, for that was his name, Alexander Laurent, the pianist the world adored. "I didn't mean to interrupt your concert. I hope I didn't do anything wrong." He shook his head quickly. "Wrong?" he said, almost laughing. No. You didn't do anything wrong. You reminded me why I started playing in the first place." She smiled shyly, her eyes lowering to the floor. "It's been a long time since I've played," she said again. "I used to teach children, before life got too busy." Alexander's eyes softened. "You were a teacher?" "Yes," she nodded. "A music teacher. I've taught for nearly 20 years. I loved every moment of it. But after my husband passed away and my children grew up, I stopped. I thought that part of my life was over." There was silence between them for a moment. The bustling sound of the crowd around them faded into the background. Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a simple woman, but someone who had lived, lost, and still carried music in her heart despite it all. "Clara," he said quietly, "you've played with more emotion than I've heard in years." Every note felt alive. She gave a small, sad smile. "Music never leaves you," she said softly. "Even if you stop playing, it stays inside. Sometimes it just waits for the right moment to come back." Those words hit him deeply. For years, he had played for fame, applause, and prestige. But Clara, she had played for love, for memory, for something real. He didn't know what to say next. He just nodded, humbled in a way he had never been before. "You reminded me tonight," he said finally, "that perfection is not the soul of music. Feeling is." Clara smiled gently. "And you reminded me that sometimes even a joke can bring something beautiful back to life." They both laughed softly. For a moment, they were not a famous pianist and a simple woman, just two souls connected by music. Before she left, Alexander said, "Clara, if you ever decide to play again, the world deserves to hear you." She paused, looked at him, and replied, "Maybe someday. But tonight was enough." As she walked out into the cool night air, Alexander watched her go. He felt something in his chest, not regret, but gratitude. Gratitude that fate, in the form of a playful prank, had brought him face to face with truth. Later, as he sat alone at the piano in the now empty hall, he tried to play again. But this time, his music sounded different. Softer, warmer. Every note carried emotion, not pride. He wasn't performing anymore. He was feeling. The stage lights had dimmed. The audience had gone home. But in that silent hall, something new had been born, a musician rediscovering his heart, and far away. As Clara walked down the quiet street under the soft glow of the streetlights, she smiled to herself. For years, she had hidden her gift, her love for music, thinking the world had forgotten her. But tonight, the world had remembered, and so had she. Sometimes, life brings the most powerful moments through the smallest accidents. What started as a joke had become a revelation, not just for one man, but for everyone who had witnessed it. That night. After the concert ended and the crowd slowly disappeared, the grand hall grew quiet again. The echo of applause had faded, but in the pianist's heart, something was still trembling. The lights were dimmed now, leaving only a soft golden glow over the stage. The grand piano stood there, silent, still, and yet heavy with meaning. Alexander Laurent, the world-famous pianist who had spent his life chasing perfection, sat alone before it. His reflection shimmered faintly on the glossy black surface of the instrument. He placed his hand gently on the keys, but for once he didn't play. He simply stared, lost in thought. His mind replayed the moment over and over, Clara's calm face, her hands dancing gracefully over the piano. The music that seemed to come not from her fingers, but from her heart. He had invited her on stage as a joke, expecting a moment of laughter. Instead, she had shown him something he hadn't felt in years. Real music. He leaned back, exhaling deeply. What was that? He whispered to himself. How did she? He couldn't even finish the thought. For years, he had believed that skill was everything. Speed, control, precision. But what Clara had played wasn't about skill. It was about emotion. It was pure, unfiltered feeling. He realized that somewhere along his path to fame, he had lost that part of himself. The part that played from love, not pride. The part that felt, not performed. He had been praised for his perfection, but in that moment, he knew perfection meant nothing without soul. He thought about Clara's words. Music never leaves you. Sometimes it just waits for the right moment to come back. Those words echoed inside him like a haunting melody. They carried truth, humility, and something else, peace. Alexander closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he had played, just for the sake of love. Not for cameras, not for critics, not for fame. It had been years, maybe decades. He could still recall the small, dusty piano from his childhood, the way his mother used to listen from the kitchen while he practiced. She used to say, "Play from your heart, not your hands, my boy. That's where the real music lives." But as he grew famous, he stopped listening to her voice. He replaced it with the sound of applause, and tonight, for the first time, he realized how hollow that applause had become. He placed his fingers on the keys again. Slowly, he began to play, not the grand dramatic symphonies he was known for, but something small, something fragile. A soft melody, gentle as a whisper. It was imperfect, unpolished, but it was real. Each note carried a weight of memory, a touch of regret, and a quiet sense of awakening. As the music filled the empty hall, Alexander felt tears in his eyes. They rolled down silently, landing on the piano keys, mixing with the rhythm of his heart. It was as if Clara's music had unlocked something inside him, something he had forgotten was still there. He stopped playing and smiled faintly through the tears. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a celebrity. He felt human. The next morning, his assistant found him still sitting at the piano. Eyes red but calm, a cup of cold coffee beside him. "Maestro, are you all right?" She asked softly. He looked up and nodded. "Yes," he said. "Better than I've been in years." She frowned slightly. "Do you want me to prepare the list of your next performances?" He shook his head. "No, not yet." He smiled. "I think I need to find something first." "And what's that?" she asked. He looked back at the piano and whispered, "My heart." Days passed, and word of the concert spread like wildfire. The video of Clara playing went viral. Millions watched in awe. People called it the night of truth, a night where pride met humility, and where real music returned to the world. But for Alexander, the fame meant nothing now. What mattered was the lesson that simple woman had taught him, that the soul of music isn't in how perfectly you play, but in how deeply you feel. He spent the following weeks reaching out to local schools and community centers, offering free lessons to children who couldn't afford music classes. When reporters asked him why, he simply said, "Because I met someone who reminded me what music truly is." Every evening, when he sat at his piano, he thought of Clara, her calm smile, her humble presence, her unshakable grace. He never saw her again after that night, but she didn't need to return. She had already left her music behind, inside him. Sometimes, He would look out at the sunset through his studio window and whisper, "Thank you, Clara," because through a simple act of kindness and what was meant as a joke, she had given him back something priceless. His soul, the great pianist, had finally learned that true greatness doesn't come from being admired. It comes from being moved, and as his hands glided gently over the piano once more, the music that filled the air was no longer proud or perfect. It was pure, sincere, and alive. It was the sound of a man rediscovering what it meant to feel. The next morning. Sunlight poured gently through the tall windows of the concert hall. Dust floated in the golden beams, dancing slowly in the quiet air. The stage stood empty now. No audience, no lights, no grand applause. Yet, somehow, it still felt alive, as if the echoes of that extraordinary night were still whispering through the walls. The story of what had happened spread faster than anyone could imagine. Within hours, clips from the concert were shared all over the internet. People around the world watched in disbelief as a humble woman, invited on stage as part of a prank, played with such passion that it silenced 1,000 hearts. Comments flooded social media. She reminded me of my late mother who used to play. This is what real music sounds like. That pianist's face at the end, pure respect. It wasn't just a viral video. It was a moment of truth that touched people everywhere. News channels replayed the clip. Radio hosts spoke about it. Music teachers showed it to their students as an example of humility and heart. Even children watched, amazed by how one simple act of courage could change everything. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of the city, Clara sat in her small living room holding a cup of tea. Watching the video on her old television, her hands trembled slightly as she saw herself on the screen, the same hands that had once tucked her children into bed, washed dishes, folded laundry, and, years ago, played lullabies for them on an old piano that no longer worked. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pride, but from peace. She never wanted fame. All she had wanted was to feel alive again, to touch the keys that had once been part of her soul. And now, unknowingly, she had touched the hearts of millions. The world had begun calling her the miracle pianist. People wrote letters, emails, and messages begging her to perform again. But Clara remained humble. She simply said, "I'm not a miracle. I'm just someone who never forgot how to feel." Meanwhile, Alexander Laurent, the famous pianist whose prank had started it all, found his world forever changed. He was no longer the same man who stood on stage with pride that night. The arrogance in his eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet warmth. He began to play differently now, softer, deeper, more sincere. When people came to his concerts, they noticed it. His music didn't shout anymore. It spoke. It spoke of emotion, forgiveness, and rediscovery. He started dedicating his performances to all the unknown artists who carry beauty in their hearts. One evening, during a televised interview, a journalist asked him, "Maestro Laurent, do you believe that woman Clara changed your life?" He smiled gently, his eyes glistening. "She didn't just change my life," he said. "She reminded me what it means to live." The interviewer leaned forward. "Will you ever play together again?" Alexander looked down and paused. "Perhaps not. But I think, in some way, we already are. Every time I play now, I carry a part of her music inside me." That answer went viral too. People were moved not just by the story, but by what it represented, that sometimes the most extraordinary lessons come from the most ordinary people. Months later, Alexander organized a charity concert dedicated to music teachers and forgotten artists. On the stage, he placed an empty chair beside his piano, with a small note taped to it that said, "For Clara." The hall was filled with emotion. Everyone knew what that meant. When the concert began, he played a soft, heartfelt melody, a piece inspired by the tune Clara had played that unforgettable night. The crowd listened in absolute silence. Some cried, some smiled, and many simply closed their eyes, feeling something deep and pure in every note. And though Clara wasn't there in person, it almost felt as though her spirit floated somewhere in the room, smiling quietly, watching how a small act of kindness and courage had turned into a global message of humility and hope. That night, after the performance, Alexander stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city lights shimmered, and for the first time in years, didn't feel like the great Alexander Laurent. He just felt human.